So I tend to walk around. So I'll use this. And I want to thank you, Pamela, for that really wonderful introduction. And what I'm going to talk about tonight is a very small portion of the current research that I'm doing. And I'm very much looking forward to your comments or questions that you might have at the end. So to get started, the way I want to structure this talk is first I'm going to introduce you to 3 images that you will see again during the talk. And hopefully by the time you see them a second time, you will have a completely different understanding of what these images mean. So some of you might be familiar with this image. It's a mural by Diego Rivera, and it was initially painted in 1934 at Rockefeller Center in New York. And it was destroyed. And the reason why it was destroyed once it was finished was because Diego Rivera refused to paint out Lenin. So he then painted the exact same mural in the Museum of Fine Arts in Mexico City, where you can see it today. And if you can, it's absolutely stunning. The second image that I want you to think about, that you will see again during the talk, is this one, which is a photograph, a stock photograph, that I found in the Rockefeller Archives Center in upstate New York, about an hour and a half from New York City. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. But I just want you to take a look at this world of plenty that we're seeing, and how that is being understood as who is feeding the world. The third image is this one, which you probably looked at while you were having your first course. And this is a living library that you can see between February and April, actually a little bit past late January to early April, in northern Mexico. And I call it a living library because as far as the eye can see, it is documenting all of the varieties of wheat that have been developed in this site that have fed the world. From this single experiment station, more than 70% of today's world wheat varieties are derived from this research station. Let me repeat that. More than 70% of the wheat that is consumed around the world comes from Mexico, from this single research site. So today, I'm going to talk about why this history is not better known. So while I will be beginning the talk for about the first 10 minutes about a history of the Green Revolution, which many of you will be familiar with, I will then make a pause and go back to these images, where you will hopefully have different questions. Okay, so this talk isn't just about solving global solutions. It's about how we tell histories of scientific discovery. Who are the protagonists, whose histories are told, and whose histories are pushed aside or erased. Okay, so for the first 10 minutes, I will give you a background history so that we're all on the same plane, so that we all have a background history before I really launch into what is my own research. So most histories of the Green Revolution, which I will get to and define in a bit, start in 1943, when Henry Wallace, who was then vice president-elect, goes to Mexico, and he decides to take a trip around Mexico. In particular, he was interested in the agricultural regions of Mexico. And what he sees, he's very concerned. And these are the images that then come out in Life magazine. And what you see is what you would expect of the stereotype of what Mexico was at the time. Barefoot, indigenous farmers, eking out a living. Wallace is so concerned when he comes back to the United States that he meets with the directors of the Rockefeller Foundation. And he says, we have a real problem. Mexicans are not producing enough food. They lack technology. They lack the tools to yield more. He said, and this is a concern for us because look at the year. It's 1941. What's happening in the world? Exactly, World War II. And feeding the world is a real concern. But more importantly, establishing friendly relationships with your neighbors. So Wallace, in conversations with the Rockefeller Foundation, convinces the foundation to shift their focus, which had been public health since the beginning of the 20th century. The Rockefeller Foundation had been interested in providing vaccinations, health education, training of other of citizens from the global community in the United States. But they noticed that not much was changing with regard to health. People were still getting sick. And the reason many of these programs, after millions of dollars, were not working, people were malnourished. And they realized we cannot change the patterns of health if people aren't eating well. And if you are a foundation that is devoted to changing the landscape of the world, you say, we may have looked at this problem differently. We needed to start with food. And the way that that's going to change is we're going to look at agrotechnology. We're going to make crops yield more. And coincidentally, that's around the time that Wallace comes and says, there's a problem. We need to have farmers in Mexico yielding more. Now, here's something really interesting. Wallace did not go to the commercial farming areas of Mexico. He went to the southern regions where there are poor farmers. He went to the regions where you expect to see this level of poverty, not northern Mexico, where the wealthy commercial farmers were. And that is a really important detail that I need you to keep in mind. So in 1943, the Rockefeller Foundation and the Mexican government come together, and they're going to create a program that's called the Mexican Agricultural Program, or MAP. And the project of the MAP is to create plants or study plants so that they can yield more and potentially end world hunger. And they're going to start in Mexico. And the idea is that Mexico will serve as a laboratory, that they will then pass this knowledge that they obtain in this space to the rest of the world. And in 1943, when the Rockefeller Foundation arrives in Mexico, it completely changes how people speak about agriculture at this time. It's no longer a question of subsistence agriculture, but rather one that will fuel the dreams of urbanization, of industrialization, and export of grains. Not corn, which is Mexico's main product at the time, but of grains. So Mexico is going to shift from being a producer of corn to being a producer of wheat. Now, it's at this time, remember I'm giving you the baseline story, that we have a series of scientists and agronomists that go from Minnesota, from various universities in the United States to Mexico. They're all plant scientists, plant pathologists specializing in wheat, in corn, in potatoes. George Harrar, Edwin Wellhausen, and you've probably all heard of Norman Borlaug. So in 1943, under the auspices of MAP, the Mexican Agricultural Program, they arrive in Mexico. And one of their main concerns, because they're interested in wheat, is how will they create crops that are resistant to stem rust, a disease that tended to, in some cases, eliminate entire crops of wheat. And it was a disease that they thought they could eliminate by creating wheat seed varieties that were resistant to stem rust. Because what happened, in addition to stem rust, wheat, which tended to be quite tall, would lodge or fall over. And this was a real problem for farmers. So scientists come together and they said, well, if we're trying to combat a disease and the very structure of wheat, why don't we create seeds that will be stem resistant, but also shorter? And that way, if you have these winds, they won't topple the wheat. But in order to do that, you need experimental stations. You need land to be able to cultivate these ideas that you have and test them out. And not only do you need land, so this is an experimental station, and Mexico donates the lands to the MAP program, and it's in central Mexico. And they also have a second station in northern Mexico. Remember I mentioned the commercial farmers of the north? There was already an experimental station there. And this is where ingenuity comes in. In 1947, the Rockefeller Foundation, there was this report in their archives And they mention this. Communism makes attractive promises to underfed peoples. Democracy must not only promise as much, but must deliver more. Asiatic and other underprivileged people attribute their present plight to the domination of the capitalist colonial system. In this struggle for the minds of the men, the side that best helps satisfy man's primary needs for food, clothing, and shelter is likely to win. So it was no longer just a question of forming relations with neighbors, but it was also now the era of the Cold War. And to win not just the minds of people, you also needed to win their bodies. So suddenly this interest in producing more yields had a political twist as well. And the idea was, if we could use agricultural science, this would be a key component in the war between capitalism and communism. And American science and ingenuity were going to win out. And this is where the ingenuity part. Do you remember those two research stations I just introduced you to? One was in central Mexico, and it was in a mountainous, very rainy region. And the other one was in the north, in Ciudad Obregón, which is almost at sea level, and it's right on the border with the Sonoran Desert. So Norman Borlaug says we're trying to create these seeds, but it takes about 8 years for a variety to really take hold, the genetic structure. What if we shuttle them back and forth, literally on trucks? We plant one season here in the winter, we truck it down and plant the same seeds that we've collected in the spring, then bring them back and forth. Instead of 8 years, it will take 4 years. And what we will create will be seeds that are widely adaptable. Wide adaptability to both rain, rainy areas, to desert, to altitude, and to sea level, all in one seed. And they will be lower to the ground, dwarf seeds, and they will be high yielding. They will be hybrid seeds that have been created to serve all of our needs. And incredibly, they're successful. Within a very short amount of time, within less than a decade, wheat production in Mexico has been transformed. Here we have a picture with Norman Borlaug, with then Vice President Henry Wallace, Mexico's Minister of Agriculture, Marte Gomez, and the former Mexican president, 1944. Look at the height of this wheat. It's no longer that tall, gangly wheat that these researchers or even these politicians had grown up with. It's now a lower dwarf wheat that still produces quite enough, a significant more yield. And it marvels them. They say this wheat is going to transform the world. So you can see the difference here with the taller wheats. And science is saying we can tweak plants. And we can tweak them to produce what we need and what we want. So the idea was to produce a series of varieties that are capable of out-yielding all local varieties, no matter where you planted them. If they were planted in Argentina, if they were planted in Costa Rica, in India, or in Turkey, they would outdo any local variety because they had been tweaked enough to succeed in any soil. Now, some of you might realize that this might be problematic, but it is the hubris of technology and of science. And at the time, it appeared that they were going to really make it. Around that time, in the early 1960s, a famine breaks out in India. The monsoon rains did not come. In India and Pakistan, it's predicted that 17 million people will die. These were the periodic famines that had been hitting India since colonial times. And this famine in particular was a dramatic one because this was after partition, a new government was in place, and India needed to find a solution. And India turns to the United States, and the United States offers it a loan, PL 480. And India says, no, we don't want loans. What we need is help with farming, with agriculture, with technology. And India keeps looking and turns to Mexico, and Mexico says, we have hybrid seeds that we have been developing in our own soil. So in the spring of 1966, The largest wheat shipment leaves the Mexican countryside from the port of Guaymas in Sonora and heads first initially by truck, then by ship. And all of this seed was being produced. Do you remember those northern commercial farmers of Mexico who had been storing this seed? And these are all images from the Rockefeller Archive Center. And they go on to India. So for those of you who can't see, it says India Supply Mission going from Sonora, Mexico, to Bombay. And the idea is that these are the seeds that are going to halt the famine. And miraculously, they do. The seeds are initially planted, and they yield more wheat than has ever been yielded at that time in India. But there is a key problem. The wheat had a reddish tinge. So when the chapatis came out and were made, they were pink in color. So despite the fact that there was a famine, people refused to eat pink chapatis. So Indian scientists themselves had to tweak it again, this lerma rojo seed, which was the name of the hybrid seed that had been created, so that it would look more appealing to the cultural sensitivities of an Indian public. Okay, so here's when they arrive, the sacks of seeds that will then be distributed. And they arrive first after Bombay to Delhi and the Punjab, which is one of the areas where I do my research. So within a number of years, so in 1964, India produced 9.8 million tons of wheat. In 1969, just 5 years later, it produced 18 million, almost double. Pakistan produced 4 million, and in those same 5 years was producing 7 million tons of wheat. This is remarkable, especially for highly agricultural societies. So what does this mean? Why was this even important? Some of you might remember that in the 1960s, there was a real concern about overpopulation and that the lack of food. You might have read the book, The Population Bomb, by Paul Ehrlich, in where he's saying, we will be starving to death. There is this real crisis, and it will be coming from the developing world. They are underfed, and they will rebel, and there will be social unrest. You might remember or might have seen the movie Soylent Green, where the secret was there wasn't enough food. People had to eat people. Sorry if you haven't seen it, I just revealed the end. But this is the world in which these hybrid, high-yielding seeds emerge. And they seem, for all intents and purposes, really miraculous. And the rest of the world thought so. So this was just a quote from Ehrlich's book. The battle to feed all of humanity is over. Hundreds of millions will starve to death in the 1970s. 65 million of them would be Americans. India would essentially be doomed, cease to exist. England will not exist in the year 2000. Well, we know he was a little bit off, but the concern was very real for politicians, for policymakers, for scientists. And in this world, you have what appeared to be a solution. And there was also the concern that we were living in a Cold War era. So the director of the USAID said, these seeds are remarkable. They will transform the world. These and other developments in the field of agriculture contain the making of a new revolution. It's not going to be a violent red revolution like that of the Soviets. And it's not going to be a white revolution like that of the Shah of Iran. I will call it a green revolution. It will be a revolution in agriculture that will transform the world, provide food, and bring about peace. And, most important, a capitalist society. So the Green Revolution was this idea that increased irrigation, increased fertilizer, mechanization, and pesticides, together with hybrid seeds, would produce more wheat. And it did. You saw the numbers. Now, I just need you to step back a little bit. Look at this list. If you are a subsistence farmer and you suddenly need to create irrigation ditches, irrigation canals, you need to buy fertilizer because these seeds only do well when you fertilize them, and they need a lot of water. You also need tractors, because these seeds have been designed for large expanses, not for the small plots that most of the world's farmers have. You also need to buy pesticides. And hybrid seeds can only be used once, because they lose their potency the second time around. So they need to constantly be bought. You could no longer save seed for the following year. And if you did, that seed would age, and it would age badly, and your yields would eventually go down. So the Green Revolution in yields looked remarkable. But once you began to peel away the layers, there were some problems, especially if you were poor and you were a small farmer. But the yields are everything, and it looks like it's an incredible success. John D. Rockefeller goes to Mexico in 1967 to celebrate the success of what has happened in these research stations. And in 1970, Norman Borlaug is awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for ending world hunger. And he's named the father of the Green Revolution, this incredibly technological change. And he's honored in part because he ended world hunger by increasing world's food supply through the use of science. Science had defeated hunger. This long time problem since we have walked the earth had finally been eliminated, and it had been through agricultural technology. He became known as the man who fed the world, how he's often depicted. This is the title of one of the dozens of books about Norman Borlaug. And in his Nobel Lecture, he says that it was the unusual breadth of adaptation, the seeds, remember? Wide adaptability, combined with high genetic yield, short straw, and strong responsiveness and high efficiency in the use of heavy doses of fertilizer, and a broad spectrum of disease resistance that has made the Mexican dwarf varieties the powerful catalyst that they become in launching the Green Revolution. Let me just underline, heavy doses of fertilizer that are needed to produce more seed with these magic seeds. So in 1976, the United Nations Research Institute for Social Development says, let's look at the socioeconomic ramifications of using these magic hybrid seeds. Let's see what's happening literally on the ground to people who have been using these seeds for less than 10 years. And what they find, so they sent 22 researchers around the world to Tanzania, Ethiopia, India, the Philippines, because there was also hybrid rice that was being used at this time. And they send this young researcher to Mexico, Cynthia Hewitt de Alcantara. And she will spend 2 years living with a farmer family in a very small community in northern Mexico. And what she finds is remarkable. And she writes nearly a 380-page report and delivers it to the United Nations. But before she does that, she gives the draft to Norman Borlaug. I interviewed her just a few weeks ago. And I said, what did he say? Because this is an incredible book. And he says, she came back a couple of weeks later and said, did you read the book? And he said, yes. And if what you've written is true, my life has been in vain. This is 1976 when the book comes out. And the reason he says this is what she finds in these poor peasant communities. Peasants were indebted. Peasants were incapable of purchasing seed. It had completely eliminated the social networks and structure because this seed technology had been designed for commercial farmers, not for subsistence farmers, who had to alter their whole way, even when they planted. And she details this in this amazing book that becomes one of the canons for understanding rural Mexico at the time. And then, just a generation after, we begin to see the negative effects of the Green Revolution. In fact, it's not good for the soil to use so much fertilizer. So it was environmental. You begin to see pollution because of the runoff of nitrogen into the watersheds, or the runoff of nitrogen from using so much fertilizer into the oceans. In the Sea of Cortez, currently today, you still have kelp forests that are so dense that they are killing the fauna. They're killing the fish. And it's from the runoff of the experimental station land and the agricultural zones of northern Mexico. Diminishing water sources, pesticide resistance, not to mention the public health concerns of using so much pesticides. The social is small plot farmers. The purchase of seeds, this constant need, so you needed capital. And most of these farmers, how were they going to get capital? How were they going to borrow money? So it becomes it's agriculture that is reliant on industry, and it begins to create regional inequalities. You may have heard of this. You may have read this in the news. In 2015 and 2016, the farmer suicides that were happening in the Punjab. When I was there, it was 5 farmers per day who were killing themselves because they were so indebted. And this all links back to changing farming practices that were begun in the 1960s. So in 2018, there were a couple of farmers who set themselves on fire as protest that in their inability to pay these fees to seed sellers, to fertilizer sellers, to pesticide sellers, and their inability to get loans from banks because precisely they are very small plot farmers. But let's go back to the science, because that's what we're also interested in. So the key was, if you could unlock the true genetic potential of wheat and create seeds that were highly responsive to fertilizer and designed for irrigation. So Borlaug continues this narrative of success despite increasing evidence to the contrary, that wide adaptability did not really exist. What existed was increasing fertilizer use. So of course you're going to yield more if you're increasing fertilizer. So what Indian scientists, remember, it goes from Mexico to India. And for the past few years, I have been following the trajectory of the seeds, going from the research stations in Mexico to the research stations in the Punjab, speaking to agronomists who are now in their late 80s, early 90s, who worked with Borlaug, and asking them, what did you think about the science? And they said, well, we had questions. But this was science that was coming from the Rockefeller Foundation. This was science that was coming as aid. We weren't going to question this aid. So, interestingly, the Mexican Sonoran farmers become the model for the type of farming. But do you remember I mentioned these farmers from the north? They are not your subsistence farmers. The minimum they have is 100 hectares of land. They have an army of workers. They are politically connected. Most of the farmers that I had been speaking to had ancestors, two of whom had been Mexican presidents. So it was a very different landscape. But these were the farmers with whom Norman Borlaug was working. So what it creates is a very different model that then is a model that is exported to the rest of the world. So in the Office of Mexican Studies, it's the acronym in Spanish, peaked in 1956 with 118 scientists, 100 of whom were Mexican. The idea I mentioned, the reason I put this slide up was when we think of the Green Revolution, we tend to think of a single individual. We tend to think of Norman Borlaug, and not as we all know, the army of scientists, most of whom were Mexican scientists. And this is the image that hopefully brought you to this dinner today. And hopefully you'll feel like you had a good meal beyond the actual food that you're having. So my question is, what traveled with the seeds? Was it just the technology and the science? Or what else travels when you move seeds from one space to the other? What traveled was actually quite interesting. And we get an idea of what travels from the memos of Octavio Paz. Turns out that when the Mexican seeds arrive in India in 1966, Octavio Paz, who would later win the Nobel Laureate for Literature, was ambassador of Mexico in New Delhi. And he is the Mexican politician who is there to see the arrival of these Mexican hybrid seeds. And he begins to write dozens of memos and is sending them back to Mexico City. Can anyone guess what he's saying in these memos? Any ideas? he's saying it's remarkable what is happening in the Indian countryside. But India right now is in chaos. And what's more surprising, Mexico is never mentioned. It says everyone acknowledges them as being Mexican seeds, but nobody talks about Mexico providing the seeds. Everyone talks about them as Norman Borlaug seeds or American aid. And he writes these memos and he says, I am very concerned. And I have to say, if you're ever going to read bureaucratic memos, they better be written by a soon-to-be Nobel Prize winning author, because they're absolutely beautiful. And he does this deep analysis, and he says, if Mexico does not act soon, we will be written out of the history of the discovery of hybrid yield seeds. He's writing this in the 60s. And he has a series of recommendations. He says, I think the Mexican president should contact the Indian president and ask, why is Mexico not commemorated? They just commemorated the Rockefeller Foundation. They just made a stamp, but there's nothing for Mexico. And he keeps writing these memos. There's dozens of them. And he's really concerned because he understands something that many won't understand for a while, that it is the narrative of scientific discovery, which is so important. And he, as a writer, understands that it's important to write the history and to write protagonists into the history, or else it will take decades before their stories are known. So here is Octavio Paz with then Prime Minister Indira Gandhi. He's in the back looking like he's checking out her house. But otherwise, let's go back to northern Sonora. And Pamela, how much time do I have left? I just want to... Okay. Okay, great. It's wonderful. Okay, so now you have this background information. Let me take you back to northern Mexico and take a look at what's happening there today. Because aren't you a little curious to see what this space where so much wheat that transformed the world was produced? So if you stay in the hotel, you will walk past to get out of the hotel by the Norman Borlaug Ballroom. And to get to the experimental station, you go down Boulevard Dr. Norman E. Borlaug. To arrive to the experimental station, Norman E. Borlaug, which is the largest research station for agriculture in northwestern Mexico. Do you see a trend here? And every year, they have this extraordinary field day called the Day of the Agricultor, or Day of the Farmer. And it's the shadow, or the ad, is the shadow of Norman Borlaug. It's very difficult to get outside of the very benevolent. He's beloved. And every memory from all the farmers and from the scientists speak of what an incredible human being he was. But it's very difficult to move outside of his shadow if you're trying to tell a very different story. In that research station, 1/3 of his ashes are buried. And when you walk into the research station, this is the monument that you see. All the flags of the world with the wheat, and in the back, there's a small box containing his ashes, or 1/3 of them. So what happened? Mexico is now considered, for plant scientists, in particular wheat scientists, they say Ciudad Obregón, where that research station was, is the mecca of wheat science. If you haven't gone to Ciudad Obregón, you really are not a wheat scientist. So every year, hundreds, if not thousands of researchers from around the world come to learn the techniques that were perfected in the 1960s and have continued to feed scientific research since then. In the South, do you remember that second research station from the 1950s, is the headquarters of the International Maize and Wheat Improvement Center, which is part of the CGIAR, some of you may have heard, consortium of research on wheat, corn, and rice that has research stations around the world. The headquarters are in Mexico City, where one of the largest seed banks is found in the world. It's not a seed vault like the one in Svalbard in Norway, but it's a seed bank where you can come and deposit and remove seeds. And this is a really important center. In 2013, then the 2 richest men in the world, Bill Gates and Carlos Slim, a Mexican, gave the money to Cimmyt to create a biosciences complex. And they gave the money to Cimmyt because they said, we need to design, let's see if this sounds familiar. We need to design a seed that will be capable of ending the world hunger that is coming because of climate change. So as scientists, we have a new endeavor. We have a new problem. We know what's coming. It's climate change. How are we going to feed the world if water is lacking, if lands are becoming more arid? So what we will do is design a seed, a hybrid seed, that is capable of sustaining this coming climate change. So they donate millions of dollars to this endeavor, and basing it on the technology of decades of research that have been completed in both of these research stations. And this is a really blurry picture. But Cimmyt also sends for free to any farmer anywhere in the world who wants seeds. They basically deliver the seeds to those farmers. What this means is that these hybrid seeds continue to dominate not just the market, but the research around the world. The director at the time joked and said, we are DHL's #1 customer in Mexico, because we basically, anyone who wants seeds anywhere in the world can ask us and we send them for free. They also train hundreds of researchers per year who come to Cimmyt headquarters and can spend upwards of years or as few as a month learning the technologies of seed, but also plant pathology and other sciences. So just very briefly, what does that mean for my research? So these are the two spaces, Ciudad Obregón and Ludhiana. We're on the border with Pakistan, where I travel back and forth. And what I'm doing, as I said earlier, I'm speaking not just to agronomists and scientists, but I'm also speaking to farmers to try to understand how they understand science and how they tell the stories of what agricultural technology means to them. Why? Well, it turns out that, well, can anyone see something here? If you flatten the world, turns out that Sonora in northern Mexico lines up almost perfectly, just by a few degrees, with the Punjab. The seeds were designed to be successful. It's no coincidence that they were first sent to the Punjab, because the seeds were designed to be in a space that was similar to that of Sonora. That alters our perspective of what was happening. Also, there was research that was already being done in Mexico. An agricultural society. It wasn't 1943 when science begins. This had been a society that had for decades been working on agricultural science. But what the type of science that they were focused on, the type of farmer that they were focused on, were small plot farmers. It was not a capitalist endeavor. So the researchers were not focused. Sorry, I'm just going to pass this because I know I'm running out of time. I'm just going to go through this because I want to get to one quick image here. So one of the researchers who had been doing research that differed significantly from that was brought with the Rockefeller Foundation and with Norman Borlaug was an Indian national who had fled the British Raj and had found refuge in Mexico and had become a teacher in Mexico's National School of Agriculture. And one of the things he was working on was hybrid corn and hybrid wheat. And he was teaching, creating these free schools of agriculture. And he befriends a muralist, Diego Rivera, who had gone to the National School of Agriculture to paint a mural. And he had brought with him his muse, who was going to pose as nature, Tina Modotti, an Italian photographer whose name you may have heard of. So Tina Modotti takes these pictures of Cancoge in his laboratory in Mexico City. And she's so interested by the hybrid wheat that she will do a whole series of hybrid plants of the seeds. But Diego Rivera is also entranced by agricultural technology. And he will join Cancoge in this enterprise to create free schools of agriculture, more than 100, and he sits on the board. And so there is Diego Rivera at one of the rallies for these national schools of agriculture. The reason I'm mentioning this, I want to go back to this picture. Did you think I had forgotten? So it was originally called Man at the Crossroads, because man was really at the crossroads. What were you going to do when you harnessed atomic energy, when you harnessed science? Where were the paths? Were the paths going to lead you to protests, to wars, or to a different world? Because were you going to end diseases, or were you going to find a new world? But before you could harness the power and the energy of the atom, you needed to understand agriculture. Do you see what's at the front row? And these plants were designed, let's see, oops. They are the hybrid plants that Kankoje Pandurang was working on in his laboratory, whom he had befriended. And he will paint him in one of the murals that is called Our Daily Bread, as the man who is creating these hybrid seeds in the 1930s, well before the arrival of the Rockefeller Foundation and before the arrival of American scientists. And it's the people of the world, the races of the world, and they're all being fed by an Indian scientist in Mexico. So Kankoje, when the Rockefeller Foundation comes to Mexico, I have found his letter requesting employment because he didn't have a job. Mexico, with every cycle of a political, with a new president, all those who had worked would lose their job and they would have to reapply. And the response to Kankoje, written in the Rockefeller archive, is that he has socialist tendencies that would not benefit the ideas of the Rockefeller Foundation. So I bring this up because we might have had a very different model to feed the world if we had incorporated other histories, other stories. So just one more minute. I just want to briefly go back to Ciudad Obregón, that research station in the north, because what has been developed there is quite extraordinary. Technology has been used in a way that I haven't seen it anywhere else in farmlands. Every dot or every light that you see here, this is the Yaqui Valley, and they have technified the valley where they can control water to the liter. So if you are a farmer and you need a certain amount of water, you have to tell them how much seed you are planting, what your crop will be, and you will pay for water. And 10% of that will go to research. So for the past 60 years, the farmers in this valley have been paying scientists to continue to design seeds for their consumption. It's remarkable. They have something that's called the command center, which 24/7 tells you where these pumps are, who's there, and who is entering the spaces where the seeds are being developed. Here you can see how they are controlling, because they are in the desert, and the desert keeps expanding closer and closer to these farmlands. So water is essential. These farmers that control this technology are at the forefront of agricultural technology right now. And they're also benefiting because that research station is just across the road from where they are. And it's continued to function. So this is what you will find in these farming stations. This link and this understanding and an embrace of technology that I haven't seen elsewhere, because these are not subsistence farmers. These are wealthy farmers. And finally, sorry, that's speaking to, I know, just one more minute. Speaking to the Punjabi farmers and the Punjabi scientists, we get a very different story. Because there, they don't have the research station that the Mexican farmers had. So a very different trajectory developed, in which instead of the farmers giving the knowledge or providing having the conversations with the scientists, in the Punjab, it's a very top-down conversation. A very different model, a model that was developed earlier and was brought to the Punjab. Okay, I just wanted to get to that last photo. Okay. So for the past, as I said, here are some of the agronomists that I have been interviewing, and I wanted to get back to this photo. So now if someone asks you, What was the country that in the 20th century fed the world? Hopefully, you will have a much more complicated response. And what we understand is that solutions to hunger are not based on science, because hunger is not a scientific problem. As we know, hunger is a social problem. And the solutions to end hunger, as we can see from that first image, where it was a catalog of all the varieties that had worked up until a certain point. At some point, science is defeated. And what we need to do is change how we do scientific research, but also the social structures in the countryside. Thank you so much.